This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Today's show begins with Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken from K-State on their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast, discussing groundhogs, the damage they can do, how to control them, but also the positives they provide. K-State small ruminant specialist Kelsey Bentley continues the show, talking about preparing ewes and does for breeding season. Mike Brouk, K-State dairy specialist, ends the show as he says there is technology that can help producers track and better manage heat stress in their livestock on the farm. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. We're going to talk about some land critters today, and I grew up seeing these guys all the time. We're going to talk about groundhogs today, huh, Drew? So what do you got to share about them?
Well, I took a look at our website this morning, and groundhogs are one of the pages that's getting the most hits right now. And just yesterday, I got a call about a groundhog problem. Had some traps strung out around the state already this year for helping people that were dealing with groundhogs. So I figured it was a good topic today.
Sounds great. Now, growing up, I heard them called woodchucks a lot. Is that same thing? Are they different because that was in Ohio, or is that's a common name for them, too?
That's one of the common names for them. Marmota monax is the critter that we're talking about if we look at the Latin name, but they've got a whole bunch of different common names. So depending on where you are, you might call them groundhogs, woodchucks, chucks, whistle pigs, whistlers, ground pigs, thickwood badgers, Canada marmot, monax, moonac, weenucks, red monk, land beaver, and if you're in French Canada, you might call them a sea flu.
Well, I think I'd be remiss if we had this entire episode and I didn't ask if a woodchuck could chuck wood. So are they playing with wood? Are they eating wood? What's their diet look like?
They're called woodchucks because they tend to be associated with woodlands, right? But, we do have that, how much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood?
Yeah.
And my mammalogy lab TA, when I took mammalogy, he asked us that on a test. And apparently there was some mammologist at one point in time that did a calculation about that. And I'm going to get this wrong, but the number that I have in my head from like 20 years ago was 12 board feet. That's probably wrong, but they don't toss wood, right? But if a groundhog was picking up sticks and throwing them,
not very long.
No.
So they're found in the woodlands. What kind of things are they eating?
Yeah, so they're herbivores. They will eat a little bit of animal material. If a groundhog is digging around and it finds a skink or a shrew or something like that, they will eat that, consume that animal matter. They'll eat a few insects, but their diet is by and large going to be plant matter. And they're going to select broadleaf plants that have a lot of protein and that are easy to digest and that sort of thing. Lots of leafy greens. They're going to eat some stems. They'll also eat root vegetables like carrots and those sorts of things as well. But they're going to select broadleaf plants that are very nutritious and not woody things.
Do they get into crop fields, agricultural fields, and do much damage there?
They can. They tend to cause the most damage in hay meadows like you talked about, and where we would see the most damage in terms of forage consumption in a hay field would be like alfalfa or a broadleaf forage crop like that.
I mean, and I would guess in town, digging up gardens or something like that could be a problem.
Sure. That's, the main conflict that people have with them eating things tends to be in vegetable gardens because they like to eat the things that we plant that we want to consume. So that's a big challenge there. They'll also eat some herbaceous plants that folks plant as landscaping plants too. And then we also have, we talked about how big and deep those burrows are.
Yeah.
Well, if they dig under your house or if they dig under under a shed, they dig under a sidewalk. That's not just unsightly. That could also cause, a shed to fall in a little bit or something like that. And so, that digging activity is something that bothers a lot of people too.
If they're making a den or a burrow where we don't want them, what are some things we could do? I'm guessing blocking the hole, but what are some things we could do to control, these groundhogs that might be around?
Yeah, so if we think about our HER acronym that I like to go back to, habitat modification is what H stands for. That's the first thing. And so the limiting open foundations would fall under that for sure. Another thing that could be included in habitat modification is just limiting the amount of cover that we have available. Groundhogs also like to dig burrows underneath wood piles and rock piles and those sorts of things. They're going to dig a burrow in a place with lots of low cover if they can as well. Other things, if we think about exclusion, it can be hard to exclude groundhogs because they dig under most fences. They're also really good at climbing. If we think about a fence that would be good at excluding groundhogs, think about like 2-inch by 4-inch rectangles in a woven wire or a welded wire metal fence.
Yeah.
We need to have about a foot of fence that's buried. And then when we get down to that foot deep, we also need about a 1-foot apron coming out that's making an L. So the fence goes down a foot into the soil and then a foot out. And then we would bury that part. And then that fence also needs to be 2 to 4 feet tall, at least 2 feet tall, and then have a hot wire on top so that if they go to climb it, they're going to get shocked.
If we can't keep them out, what do we have to do?
If we're in a rural area where we can legally discharge and safely discharge a firearm, they're diurnal. They're like most squirrels. They're active during the daytime. And so especially if we go out in the early morning or evening time, they like to feed during the early morning because they get a lot of their water from dew.
What about if you can't be shooting them? Are there things you can do in town?
Yep, there are. And cage traps work quite well for trapping groundhogs. So we're looking for like a raccoon-sized cage trap is what I would call it. At least a 10-inch by 10-inch opening where the door's at, and then at least 24 inches long. A 12 by 12 by 36 trap would work just fine too. If it's got 2 doors, if it's got a door on each end, it's going to need to be a little bit longer, so in that 30-inch plus range, just so that you're getting the doors closed completely while the critter's in there. And if it closed on its head, then it could slide out from underneath, right? We're trying to limit that. Cage traps tend to be most effective for groundhogs, at least from my experience, if we cover them. So I like to cover them. I typically go by a canvas tarp. The plastic type tarp material will work just fine, but it's kind of rattly. And so I just feel like that canvas tarp lays better in the wind and doesn't make noises that might spook them away. Putting that trap fairly close to their burrow entrance works quite well. And we want to really work that trap back and forth on the surface of the soil so that it sits there stably and doesn't have a bunch of gaps underneath of it. So if their feet start to fall through those holes in the bottom of that cage when they go in, they might not feel comfortable and they might not go in. Similarly, if the trap wobbles when they start to come in, they're probably not going to go in as well.
So if you do catch one of these groundhogs in a trap, what do you do with them?
Sure. So, one of the things that I think we sometimes forget to mention is that it's always important to check all your local laws and regulations and that sort of thing about take of wildlife. So if we're thinking about groundhogs in Kansas, they're classified as huntable non-game, so they can be shot or trapped by anyone who has a hunting license and is using appropriate equipment. If landowners or legal occupants are experiencing property damage, then they are authorized to remove those groundhogs too, but they can't utilize them in any way. So they wouldn't be able to eat them or save the skulls or the skins or anything like that. So if you do catch a groundhog, wildlife managers almost never recommend moving critters around. Most of the time when we move critters, they don't live. So euthanizing them is the most appropriate thing to do if you do need to remove them. And just remember that this is a critter that hibernates. And so in order to hibernate and survive, they need to be able to find an appropriate spot to dig a den, and then they need to have time to excavate that great big old den. And a lot of our groundhog problems pop up during that hyperphagy time, right before they go to hibernate. And so if you trap and move a groundhog during that time frame, then it's very likely you're giving it a death sentence just because it's not going to have time to find a den.
We've talked a lot about, some of the problems with groundhogs. Do they have any purposes in nature? What are some of the benefits of them?
Sure. Well, one of the challenges is, like, if we start to try and associate a human purpose with critters, then sometimes it can be pretty hard to come up with one.
Sure.
People like deer because we like to eat deer and we like to watch deer and those sorts of things. Some people like groundhogs because they like to eat them.
Yeah.
But they're a native herbivore that's supposed to be out there eating vegetation. They disturb the soil, and so the digging activity that they do is actually good for soil health and all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily something that's good if you're a farmer and you're going to drop into their hole, but it is something that's a natural process that's good. They provide food for a lot of predators. If we're thinking about reasons that groundhogs can be good for people, one of the things that they're really important for is on the research side of things. So groundhogs have liver function and chemistry that's most close to human liver function and chemistry of any mammal that we can use for research. So they're actually the main model for research on how to treat people for liver cancer and hepatitis and those sorts of diseases. Wow. So they're important that way.
Once again, that was Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode. You can hear the whole episode by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net or by searching for Fins, Fur, and Feathers on your favorite podcast platform. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about getting ready for breeding for sheep and goats with K-State Small Ruminant Specialist, Kelsey Bentley. Kelsey, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Kelsey, what are some things to first consider when it comes to producers putting together a timeline for breeding?
Yeah, so when your timeline is really going to depend on what particular market of the small ruminant sector that you have. So just talking about maybe our commercial producers in Kansas first, they should consider breeding their sheep or goats in the fall so that lambs or kids are ideally born in the spring. And this timeline is kind of chosen because lamb and goat prices tend to peak between July and October, and these spring-born lambs or kids are typically ready for market within that favorable period. Lambs born before March 10th actually have a market advantage because they avoid the competition with the large number of range lambs that hit the market from Colorado. Switching gears a little bit and talking about producers that are maybe raising or animals for show, such as 4-H and FFA, breeding is going to be timed maybe slightly differently. So for Kansas County fairs in July and August, lambs and kids should be born sometime around January or early February. For our producers who are maybe targeting state fairs or later shows in September through November, the aim for birth is February or early March at the absolute latest, with some of those sheep even maybe slipping into that November-December timeline. It's also important that in the breeding, we use correct ratios if we're attempting to synchronize breeding windows. So we should always use one mature ram or buck for 30 ewes or does. And if we have a yearling ram or buck, we should drop that ratio down to only 15 ewes or does.
As we are getting those does and ewes ready, what should we be seeing in terms of physical appearance, physical health?
Body condition scoring is going to be a critical tool for managing our breeding success. So the ideal body condition score, and this is out of a 5-point scale, for breeding ewes and does is going to be ranging between a 2.5 and a 3.5. Research shows that animals that are too thin or too fat are less likely to conceive and actually have more complications during pregnancy, leading to dystocia during lambing and kidding. I also recommend the practice of nutritional flushing, or providing extra nutrition before and during breeding, as this can help not only improve our body condition, maybe during a stressful time, but it's also been shown to increase reproductive performance. This can be achieved by supplementing high-quality hay or grain about 2 to 3 weeks prior to the breeding season, and this has been seen to increase our ovulation rate by upwards of 15%. So really, really good for our producers who are going in and doing lap AI or embryo transfer. Those producers in particular need to be supplementing those ewes or does approximately 2 to 3 weeks prior to that event.
And what does a 2.5 look like on one of these animals? Yeah,
so a 2 to a 2.5 is going to be somewhat where we can see slight ribs. You are going to be able to feel a little bit of that spinous process. So if you reach back to that 12th rib, place your hand there, you're going to be able to feel some spine there. However, the caveat is you also need to be able to feel muscle. There should be some musculature, especially right there around the loin. You should be able to somewhat feel the edge of that loin, and it's on sheep where we feel all of the vertebrae. So I can feel the individual divots of vertebrae. There's no muscle there. There's no fat cover that we would then consider them to be trending towards a 2 or a 1. And if you're at a 1, it is very, very hard to get those sheep back. Metabolic disease is something that we don't want to get into. And when we are at a 1 in terms of our body condition, essentially you're in a state of emaciation, and therefore those individuals will not bounce back.
What are some other things we should do for those dams for hoping to keep them healthy as we get ready for breeding?
I think vaccination and disease prevention is probably our number one thing that we should be trending towards or thinking of as we're entering our breeding season. All breeding animals should be vaccinated against CD&T or Clostridium perfringens type C and D with a tetanus toxoid. So this should be given at least 3 to 4 weeks before breeding, especially within our does. And the reason we say that is doe and ewe are going to be providing a lot of passive immunity to lamb. So getting this window right for when we give her that CD&T actually primes her to produce that antibody within her colostrum. So that is probably the most important thing, that CD&T, especially with our ewes and does, needs to be given 3 to 4 weeks before breeding. But then when we have lambs and kids on the ground, that CD&T vaccine timeline changes depending on, I've heard some producers say they give it as early as 2 weeks. I've heard some producers say that they maybe follow the more traditional schedule, wait till around 4 to 6 weeks, and then booster again in another 4. So really, you've got to decide what works well for you. If you have a lot of Clostridium within your area and within the soil, and you do experience a lot of losses there early in life, you might need to boost that kind of vaccine up a little bit. However, just for the regular producer out there that currently isn't battling with Clostridial disease, I think following the traditional timeline, waiting for those lambs and kids to get 4 to 6 weeks of age, giving them the initial booster, and then following that up with another booster 4 weeks later is probably most appropriate.
What about deworming?
So I always recommend we steer away from blanket deworming protocol. So that means bringing everyone into the barn and giving them all dewormer all at one time. I think actually through targeted selective treatment, through things like FAMACHA, where we can pull down the inner eyelid and kind of gauge anemia. This can even be done through looking at mucosal membranes. So even if you could just kind of pull up their gums and see their gums, a lot of times we can see anemia in any sort of membrane. So when we see those sheep that maybe have a peachy color or a really, really pale pink, those would be the ones that would maybe be ideal candidates for deworming, especially going into breeding. I think anything that is trending from a bright cherry red and we're going into breeding, needs to be in consideration for deworming. Now, if she's going into breeding and she's in an appropriate body condition, appears in overall health, we pull down that eyelid and see that she's bright cherry red, maybe she doesn't need a deworm right before she goes into the breeding season. And that's kind of up to that targeted selective treatment of whether we decide who needs treatment and who doesn't. And it really gets us away from having a lot of unnecessary deworming, because dewormers are expensive. And I try to also point that out to producers, that maybe when we are giving that dewormer unnecessarily, not only is there a cost associated with that, but we're also increasing anthelmintic resistance or dewormer resistance on our flock. And that's kind of an unforeseen cost as well that I really can't put a dollar amount on, but is something that we also want to stray away from.
What are some of those nutrition pointers you have for producers?
Yeah, so a balanced diet is essential for breeding animals, especially during the breeding season. When we talk about nutritional flushing and kind of increasing some of those nutritional needs as we go into a season where we would like to see them be really fertile, energy, protein, minerals, and vitamins should all be included in the ration to support reproductive health. So for producers who maybe don't provide mineral year-round, especially going into breeding, probably 3 to 2 months prior to breeding, we really need to be implementing a mineral program. And we also need to, going into breeding, maybe adjust our feed to help maintain that body condition score. And that's going to be kind of dependent upon where you go. So there's some producers, I go out and I visit their flocks or their herds, and maybe we're actually on the upper side of that body condition score. So describing to producers that sometimes when we go into the breeding season, we might actually need to cut back on our feed, because we do know that if they are in an inappropriate body condition going into breeding, likely they'll melt down a little bit, but they're not going to melt a ton. And then we still see a lot of metabolic dysregulation like pregnancy toxemia with sheep or goats that are at a body condition score of a 4. So really, really stressing to producers that during the time leading up into breeding, that is when we really need to be going out, keeping an eye on our flock, assessing our group's body condition. What does body condition look like for the whole and for the group? And maybe I can split some of these ewes into kind of cohorts. So if I maybe have a lot of ewes and does that they're getting to all the feed first and they're maybe a little bit more rotund, I can maybe split them off if I have access to that, feed those a little less, but I can maybe supplement my ewes or does that I think are a little bit thinner. So really keeping an eye on body condition leading into breeding is probably how we can best tailor our nutrition program to determine who we need to supplement and then who we maybe need to pull back on.
Kelsey, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
That was K-State Small Ruminant Specialist Kelsey Bentley. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. As summer heat sets in, dairy producers should be mindful of heat stress in animals. Research shows that a mild case of heat stress can result in a 2% reduction in milk production the following week. A moderate case can reduce production by 3% or more, and extreme heat stress can cause as much as an 8% reduction. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says there's new technology available that can help producers track and better manage heat stress on the farm.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning some technology that is going to help you manage heat stress on your dairy farms. As we look at the impact of heat stress to our dairy animals during the summertime, we are concerned with things like milk loss as well as losses in reproductive efficiencies. And we've done many things to try to reduce these losses over the last couple of decades. And one of the things that continues to develop is the technology that we can use to track animals as they're experiencing heat stress on our farms. Recently, NEDAP has developed some additional devices and software that helps you track what is actually going on with your dairy animals throughout the day. This is a cloud-based platform, and it allows us to take a look on a 15-minute interval what's actually going on with our animals' individual pens on our dairies. The neat thing about this data is that it shows not only the level of heat stress that animals are subjected to, but also the duration of that. So if we think about heat stress overall and its impact on our dairy animals, it's important to note that we can lose up to 8% of daily milk in the week following a single day of heat stress if it's extreme. If it's only moderate, it might be only a loss of 3% in milk production over that next week. And if it's a mild case of heat stress, maybe only about 2%. But the fact of the matter is we're losing significant milk, and often we do not gain that milk back. So, for many of us, how much stress are our animals experiencing? This new technology developed by NEDAP allows each animal to wear a sensor that detects their temperature and level of stress. This data is then compiled by pen so that you can look at your data set over 15-minute intervals to determine what level of stress your animals are actually experiencing on your farm in your own operation. So as it looks at this, it looks at basically 4 levels of stress, either no stress, mild stress, severe stress, or very severe stress. And you can then utilize this data to determine whether or not you need to increase the airflow over the cows, increase the soaking cycles on your sprinkling system, or just simply check to make sure that systems are actually working. Oftentimes we don't realize systems have quit working, and this will alert us that, hey, we've got a problem in pin 4. We need to go out and check to see what's going on and determine if there's something that needs to be repaired so that those animals actually can be protected from the heat stress that they're experiencing. Since it provides this data on a per-pin basis, we can compare different pens on our farms to determine whether or not heat abatement procedures in different pens are actually performing as they should be, or if we need to consider additional heat stress abatement in those pens based on the data that we're actually seeing. So as we move forward and trying to be more efficient on our dairy farms and trying to reduce the impact of heat stress, this new technology does offer us some opportunities to actually determine what's going on in our individual pens on a pen basis, and allows us to better manage the heat stress situation on our dairy farms. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farms to consider how they might use new technology to monitor their animals continuously for the level of heat stress that they might be exposed to.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.